This is Ken Jarecke, and today we're talking pictures with a photography legend, a man of many talents and traits, and a true mentor to me in every sense of the word. Bill Pierce, it's so glad to see you. How you doing, my friend?
I'm doing okay. But you?
I'm doing well. I'm out here in Montana, and you're out there in God's country above Malibu, watching the little people and the beautiful people, I'm sure.
And for forest fires.
Yes, keep your eyes peeled for smoke on the horizon.
Okay, so what would you like to talk
I would like you to tell me the first time you were published in Life magazine. How old were you?
about? Oh my God, I was just a little tiny kid because my neighbor was the associate press photographer. His name was Wally Stein, and he beat out the competition, which had 17 photographers from the Morning Sun Telegraph. And I used to go around and carry gear for him and stuff like that. I must have been 10 or maybe I was 15, who knows? But, I loved photography. And so Wally said, okay, come with me. And we went down and a boat had gone over a dam. It was sort of wedged on the top of the dam and everything in Pittsburgh on the Allegheny River. And he handed me his graphic and said, push the button. And I ended up in Life magazine. So that was it.
What year do you think that was?
Oh, God. Well, it was after the big war, WW2. So I don't know.
It had to be early 50s at the latest,
Maybe the early 50s, late 40s. I don't know.
right?
I mean, I graduated from high school in 53. So let's say it was probably around 51 or 52.
Okay. So you graduated high school. You went to Princeton. You didn't
Yeah.
go there to play football, I understand, but you did have a job on football Saturdays.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I had played football in high school badly and was very tiny and everything. By the time I finally hit college, it was not only do you pay so badly that we don't want to use you, but you also have injuries and we don't want to be liable. So there was a very brief period in which I was the Princeton Tiger. This was a costume with a tiger head, full tiger outfit, right? I mean, and it was made out of a real tiger skin. So it was hot, it was heavy, and it was smelly and everything. I think, not only was I a bad football player, I was a bad tiger. I lasted about, 3 weeks and that was it. Yeah.
So, you went to school. You didn't study photography, but you were kind of you're more on the scientific side of things, right?
Yeah, I started out as a physics major and
Wh-
everything. And
Which,
remember, Princeton is next door to the Institute for Advanced Study. So not only did we have great teachers, the guy who lived across the street from me was Albert Einstein. I used to sneak him into the summer theater because no, the fact is that he would create such a furor if he walked in with the audience. It wasn't like a movie theater, darkened or anything, and everybody came in at one time. And so I would sneak him in just after the lights went out. I would have a seat on the aisle, we'd rush him down, and then afterwards, we would sneak him backstage. Needless to say, the actors were incredibly impressed. But the amazing thing was, he was incredibly impressed. He loved the actors. The actors loved him and everything. Uh, I mean, Oppenheimer was, you'd see him walking around and you'd say, hello, sir. And he'd say, hello, how's it going? Yeah, it was genuinely a bizarre and strange place to be a physics major. And then later, after I graduated from school, these guys were sort of like, they'd had enough publicity. They really didn't want it. And the thing was that Einstein's protege was the big man in black hole. Nobody could get to him. So I went up for Time magazine and literally waded out across the water. He lived on an island, showed up with a picture of Einstein from the life files to give him as a gift and everything, and got his picture when he was essentially going, no picture. As a matter of fact, used the Einstein picture as a background. And I'm trying to think which was the physics theorist that he mentioned. I don't think it was Jung. I don't know who it was. We'll just say it was one of the great physics theorists, and we'll call him Mr. Jones for the purpose of storytelling. Anyway, after a number of six-packs, this physicist and I were, can we say on the internet, peeing? We were peeing in the woods. And he said, this is what great physicist Mr. Jones called the greatest example of the conservation of matter and energy. That's it. That's the punchline.
So, I mean, for lack of a better example, you were kind of a Forrest Gump throughout history. You didn't just rub shoulders with people like Einstein and Oppenheimer. After you graduated Princeton, you went and when did you start studying acting?
Almost immediately. I went to Princeton and then started studying with Sandy Meisner and earning my money as a light designer. That's the fancy name that theater uses for electrician. And, pretty much worked as an actor, minor league. But the fact was, I had great help in that, in the sense that since I was the electrician, i.e. light designer in the summer theater at school, which was amazing. It brought down all kinds of good actors. The kids had enough sense to stay out of the way and bring in good people. I was the lighting designer. Hugh Hardy was the set designer. It was an amazing crew of people. And essentially, I learned acting from people like Peter Falk and Donald Moffat. Donald Moffat, who refused to ever take leading roles because he didn't want to be typed and things like that, and did between Broadway and Hollywood movies and a tiny bit of television and directing on Broadway and actually ghost directing some movies in Hollywood, did 220 parts. This man became my friend for life. And what would happen, since I was the electrician, they would say things like, "Are you doing anything in scene 6?" And I would say no. And they'd say, "All right, you're going to play the newsboy." So yes, I studied with Sandy. But I had people like that. Amazing people. Really teaching me by example how to act. Now, beyond that, I also made them help me change the lights. This was, after all, summer theater. And then when I came to New York, I had an entrance into off-Broadway, which was just starting, because this is where all these guys were working and everything quite often. There were only 3 theaters: Circle in the Square, Sheridan Square, and David Ross's 4th Street. And I was the electrician, sometimes ticket taker, and all kinds of other things at 2 of those 3 theaters. Yeah.
So, but you studied under Lee Strasberg too, as well, didn't you?
No, but I had a friend who was in actor studio invited in, who was my roommate. His name was Amnon Meskin. His father, Aaron Meskin, was one of the lead actors with the Moscow Art. Considered a great actor. On my journalistic trips into Russia, for instance, the Moscow Art literally opened its doors because I had no Meskin and said, "You come into our rehearsals, you shoot pictures, you go see free shows, we don't care. doors open and everything. Amnon Meskin, his son, he figured that the best place to study, he left Russia. Now, he was Jewish, but he was such a star, they could have stayed without problem. But he didn't. He chose to leave. He left, by the way, with a lifelong friend, Roman Vishniak, the photographer biologist, and everything. The two of them left at the same time, went through Poland together. Vishniak ended up in America, and Meskin went to Israel, and he became the lead actor with Habima, which was, an incredibly great theater. He sent his son here to study because he thought that this was where the great teachers, including Strasberg and Meisner and Uta Hagen and all these people who had actually visited Russia at that time, were based. And his son was living in the YMCA. I myself, come on, I was a photographer. I had a loft, an old factory building, a huge floor, everything. It was primitive. There was a huge amount of space. So I just said to Amnon, what are you doing at the Y? Come room with me. So I had the son of one of the great actors of all time as my roommate, and in turn, he became the great actor in his country. It was amazing. As you know, there are a lot of Israeli actors who came over to America to play Arab terrorists on television. And, I would be introduced to somebody, and they, whoever was introducing us would always say something like, Bill has a friend who's an Israeli actor too. And the actor would say, oh, and who might that be? And, I would say, oh, he's just an old friend. He was my roommate for years. His name is Amnon Meskin. And they would go, Meskin, would you introduce us? So, yeah.
So,
I was, between lighting and acting and everything. Yeah, theater was a huge part of my life, and still is. I love theater. By theater, I mean not only stage, but motion pictures and television. And I probably have more friends who are actors and directors and writers than I have friends who work photographers.
So you're in the theater scene. You're making great progress there. You go to PBS. You're working with Fred Rogers. You're working with Jim Henson. How did photography? How did you make that leap from the theater world into the photography world? Because you did that fairly early as well.
Well, money. I mean, the fact is that I did photography. I did more people's headshots, and I'm delighted to say that some of them became quite famous and everything when I was a kid, and I just loved photography. It was my hobby. And Gene Smith was pounding on my head saying, you must become a professional photographer and everything. I mean, he was a sort of like, you can't do this as a hobby and everything. That's nonsense. And balancing Gene, of course, was David Vestal, who is exactly the opposite of Gene in style. Both of them, however, brilliant printers. And David wanted somebody to ask questions when he gave lessons and things like that. He taught classes. And so I was a plant in his classroom. And I came to the attention of Popular Photography magazine because I was also a plant when Gene would give lectures. And the wife of one of the editors went back to the magazine and said, I just attended this lecture by Gene Smith. And this kid in the audience asked these really interesting questions. And so they asked me if I wanted to start writing about photography. So, look, I needed the money. I mean, you know what acting and things is in New York City for a kid? It is no money to me and everything. So I wrote about photography and I published my own pictures. And then the Leica manual asked me if I would write about photography. So I did, I guess, what, 2 chapters or something under my own name, ghosted a couple others, published some pictures. The editor from Popular Photography went over to Time magazine. Now, at that time, Time magazine was the largest circulation news magazine in the world. And they sent people all over. And he used me. And as a matter of fact, when they quite erroneously, when Time Life quite erroneously decided that their old photographers were getting too old, which was absolute nonsense because these guys were brilliant and everything, they hired 3 new contract photographers. Eddie Adams, and everybody knows Ed from the picture of Luan, you know, shooting the terrorists. Dirk Halstead, who in Vietnam was the other wire service photographer. He was sort of the boss and everything. And while his pictures were not as spectacular as that one Pulitzer winner by Eddie, he had an incredible ability to run a team of young photographers during wartime. And then me. Who knows why me? I mean, but that was the first 3 contract photographers. I had just gotten divorced. My ex-wife was not going to be earning any money whatsoever. And I had to support 2 kids. So when, I've been shooting a little for Time, hey, I lived in New Jersey. I was closer to certain news events, things like that. I said, sure. I just plain needed the money. I mean,
so that was like 72, 73?
Hmm?
That was like in 1972, 1973, something like this?
Yeah, and I had probably been working for Time and Life and Sports Illustrated and things like that on a very rare basis, fairly frequently actually for Time. But, they were all owned by the same publisher. And for a couple of years, and they said, yeah, we want you to be one of the new contract photographers. Well, I plain bloody needed the money. It was amazing because you have to understand that every photographer wanted this job. I mean, this was it for photojournalism. This was the job. And here are 2 very, very famous photographers, that are chosen to get it. Who is this punk Pierce? Son of a bitch. I worked my entire life for this job, and this nowhere kid gets it. I was probably the most hated photographer in New York City, but I plain needed the money. I mean, there were guys who really wanted the job. I wanted the salary. So I said yes, and I became essentially a full-time photographer. I had an office in the Time Life building. It was next to Izzy and Carl Heiden's. I mean, this is something that people would die for. And furthermore, remember, because you were the last of the generation to work for magazines like that. It wasn't like, oh, there's something happening in Beirut. Call Beirut and see if there's a photographer there. It was, who's not on assignment? All right, send them to Beirut. And we literally traveled all over the world, photographing hugely important events, going places that nobody else was going, and taking headshots of incredibly famous people, which could be done in around 3 minutes. And then the 2 of you, the famous person and the little photographer, would go out for an expense account lunch. And if you did enough of those, believe it or not very many of those people remained acquaintances. But really, at the end of the career, you probably had around half a dozen rather famous, important acquaintances or friends that you bought with a Time magazine free lunch. So yeah, it was an incredible job. And you were literally you know, the last generation to do that. We were the almost last generation to do it. You know,
Well, it strikes me that, I mean, you had this analytical way of thinking. You had writing skills. You had you were a sociable person, and all this kind of led up to this dream job, I guess we
yeah,
can call it.
yeah. Oh no, without question. And look, I mean, here is the payback. People would say, "Oh, I saw your picture of so and so," to which the only answer could have been, "You should have been there," because the picture of the event is nothing compared to the event. I mean, yeah, do some people do a better picture than others? Sort of, I guess. You know, but the privilege was spending time with the famous person, going across the boundary to the unknown, nobody's ever been there country. And I will also tell you that if you want an education, well, come on, you know this. You know this already from your own experience. If you want an education in human beings, cover a war. Because the war just peels everything back from human beings and reveals what they are. And it turns out around 98% of them are pretty wonderful people. The other 2%, I'm not so sure about, but you know, the great majority of people are really quite amazing. You know, it's a hell of an education. I will tell you this: people thought that in that particular era, physics education at Princeton was, you know, pretty good. Actually, I transferred to English in my senior year, if you want to talk about what it's like to play catch-up ball. And I told a very, very famous physicist that I was leaving. I just couldn't take it anymore. And he said, "Yeah, I know. These days, all it is particle, particle, particle." My roommate developed a particle. It turned out not to exist. He had an alcohol problem after that. Uh, but yeah,
So,
the education of being, I mean, look, yeah, some of the pictures are good. Now, here's the weird thing. Some of the people in your profession and my think that the picture is good because they're good. And they tell you this in the drop of a hat. I am just absolutely tremendous. I got news for you. You're nothing. What's in front of you was tremendous, and you pushed the button. It's that simple. Look, I'll give you a classic example. The picture that everybody knows that I took, that is the famous picture, if you took it away from the subject matter, it would be one of the most god awful snapshots that you have ever seen in your life. And that's Nixon going, ying, as he leaves the White House. It takes no talent, no skill. It's not a particularly impressive picture, but it's of a very important event. Do not ask me why some people missed it. I mean, you know, it has nothing to do with artistic skill. It has to do with paying attention. You know,
so paying attention is a good point. I mean, we're as photographers, as photojournalists, we're kind of when it comes to observing, we should be pretty high on the scale of things, and that's kind of what you're pointing towards with all this training, all this acting. Acting is observing. If I'm
absolutely. It's paying attention to the people around you. It's letting them do the work for you. Absolutely. I mean, it's not showing off. It's not pretending. It's not waving your hands. It's watching those other people, listening to those other people, and having them effective, having them essentially do all the work, you know.
so speaking of doing all the work, you worked with Gene, you worked with David Vestal,
Yeah,
and as you said, they were opposites. They were friends. They respected each other,
yeah,
but they were opposites.
yeah.
But you learned. you learned a lot of what you taught me in the darkroom from Gene Smith, and I always kind of use that as a standard. I learned to print from the guy who learned from Gene, and Gene was,
Yeah,
the master. But
yeah.
tell
And
us, tell
furthermore,
us what,
he
tell
was
us.
a journalist like us. He was a journalist like us, working in uncontrolled situations that he really didn't have any control over. Where David, you know, worked, in situations where it's not that he had some control, but he could move around, he could choose where he was standing, he could choose what he wanted to photograph. It wasn't just sort of like the mad zoo of journalism. Yeah. So they had two different printing styles, but Gene's printing style, very much came from what he was doing. What happens is you take a picture, and hopefully in the middle of it, there's something sort of important happening. But there's a mess around it. You can't control it and everything. And so Gene's printing stuff was to draw attention to what was important. In other words, to take that important element in the picture, make it a little brighter, maybe a little contrasted, and not to eliminate or alter the other things in the picture, but just take them down a little, perhaps in brightness and in contrast and everything, to sort of guide the eye of the viewer through this mess that we're confronted with when we do journalism. You know, and yeah, so that's pretty much what I learned from Jane. And you know, you want look. I was going through some of my. I have to. I'm an old person now, so I have to stack up my pictures from museums. And I was going through a bunch of my pictures, and guess what? I came across a stack of pictures that you and I printed together. You remember the two people looking out over the body of water from New Jersey towards America?
Sure, sure. From Brooklyn, from Dumbo.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. And that's exactly what we did. We sort of highlighted the people and took the other, because it's a mess. It's a complicated picture, and we sort of highlighted those two people sitting on the edge, and just took the edge a little off some of the other stuff. You
So how
want
much?
back, by the way, I'll mail you your prints if you'd like them back.
Actually, Suad would like some prints of the portrait you made when I was young and handsome, and she hasn't changed at all. So we could actually do that portrait today. We just need a younger and handsome man to step in.
Well, you always had you took the prize for, photographer with the world's most beautiful wife. It was, no, I mean, what can I say?
I've been out of my league for a long time.
Yeah.
What I mean, when you think about Gene Smith's printing techniques, and he was a fan of the theater, and I'm
Sure.
wondering.
As a matter of fact, he used to, okay, I would get paid jobs to go shoot a Broadway show, right? And I would hire Gene as my assistant because he was always broke. And the things it was absolutely amazing when you had people that you were working for saying, I have no idea who the photographer is, but this is his assistant, Gene Smith.
What doesn't Gene Smith, isn't he recreating some of the same theatrical lighting techniques you used with his printing in real life situations? Isn't that kind of what he's doing, what you would do as a lighting specialist in a stage production?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Yeah. Highlight the important and, just take the less important and tone it down a little bit.
But he
And
had a drama to that too, that was very theatrical, even, you
oh,
know.
yes, sure. I mean, as a matter of fact, on his bad days, you could say there was melodrama. I mean, no, I mean, this guy would go into the darkroom and print for a day and a half. There's no other human being in the world that can do that. You know, I mean, and he would be so wired when he came out. Gene's Loft, 821 6th Avenue, which now have been documentaries and picture exhibits and all kinds of things to a degree that you cannot believe, was above a hardware store. And the thing is that in order to get to sleep after these huge sessions, Gene would take a drink, a quick shot of a scotch or a whiskey of some kind named Old Philadelphia. And it was so cheap that I swore to God he bought it at the hardware store that his loft was open and everything. I mean, it was for people who run across those documentaries. The last one is on the internet now. You know, yours truly makes a few stupid comments in it and everything. It was, what can I say? It's an absolutely amazing world, absolutely egalitarian, all kinds of amazing people mixing together. It was New York in the 50s and 60s.
I mean, you were a bit of a gatekeeper in that scene. I know the lock on the front door didn't work, but you're kind of the guy who allowed people in and out of that scene, weren't you?
Well, not really. I mean, you know, Gene was the boss. And, you know, as far as the jazz things, that would be Paul Overton and Monk and David Young, who's the painter whose loft they used. David, by the way, developed an incredible technique. He would paint on curve, he would paint with acrylic paint. He was one of the first to use acrylic. And he would paint on a curved, enameled icebox door. You would go to the junkyards and find these icebox doors, paint on it with acrylics, and then run up to a canvas and use the thing like it was a roll or a printing press and go wonk, and that would be one painting, and go over to the next canvas, and go wonk, and do another painting, and then a third one. You could get around 3 paintings out of doing acrylic on a refrigerator door: the dark one, the medium one, and the light one. And mostly my job, you know, I mean, my real job was helping Gene. But one of the things I did was he had a fan base and he couldn't get any work done. I mean, he certainly had guests. He certainly had friends. He certainly had admirers in there all the time. There were tons of people. He was not standoffish. But what would happen is sometimes on days he had to work, there would literally be a crowd of people at the front door knocking, wanting to go up, you know, almost like they were tourists. And Gene was a you know, one of the sites. You did the Empire State Building, you know, you did and Gene Smith, you were photographer. And I would have to go down and say to people, look, you know, he truly appreciates, you know, you're coming here to visit, but he's terribly has to work and everything. And so, you know, I would have to politely tell them that he was not a victim.
It's interesting. I remember the first time we met. You probably don't, but we were in the back of the bus. The boys,
Yeah.
oh, actually the front of the bus, because photographers sit in the front of the bus. That's just
Yeah.
protocol, because
Yeah.
we have to actually get out and see what's going on. And and you were with Time. You were contract with Time, and I was with Life. And I think Wally was there.
Yeah, he was Newsweek.
Um, oh, what? Sorry, I'm.
No, but there were some agency guys.
Yeah, the guy from U.S. News. Neither one of us remember all these names, I'm afraid. Daryl Hikus.
Yeah, one of the nicest, most decent human beings on the face of the earth. Yeah, good dude.
And what this was to me, it was a classroom to me. I was pretty young at the time, but I got to sit there. You know, I think, you know, Artie would be on the bus sometimes when he wasn't, you know, behind the scenes doing his special projects, and
Yeah.
it was just an opportunity to listen to you guys talk. And this background you came from, you learned from Gene, you had the ropes from the the Time magazine, and you knew how to operate. And I'm wondering who's teaching young people that today. I mean, it's such a valuable lesson, and everything you taught me, I still pull from today.
Yes, well, but you did one thing that, I mean, first of all, you were the kid on the bus. And so anybody with any decency would go over and sit next to you and say, okay, kid, this is your first time on the bus. Now we have to give you a little help, because in case you don't notice it, if you go to the front of the bus, right on the right hand side, there's a door outside of the bus. That's where you will race to, pushing others out of your way to get to the candidate. Now, and pass that other valuable information on. However, you were the one who taught all of us. And you developed the first really new photographic angle, new camera angle in presidential campaign coverage, lying down on the floor and shooting up. I don't think anybody had ever done that. And you came very, very close to it. I think you may have actually literally done it at times. I know later, when I was working abroad, I was inspired in China when they were setting up the talks between the United States and China for those first early things. I don't know who it is, but I have a picture of myself lying on my back, shooting up at the event. And it was because I was inspired by you. That was it. So teaching goes around both ways.
Well, I guess when you put it like that, there's something to be said for ignorance and and realizing that looking ridiculous while making pictures is part of the effort involved.
It's
I
also part of the fun.
well, I didn't know any better. That's what I'm saying. I just didn't know any better. Uh,
Editors crazy. They have never seen that angle before. Who is this kid? What a breakthrough.
yeah. Well, I mean, you mentioned Dirk earlier, and Dirk, one of his things was he never, as he was managing crews of photographers in Beirut or Vietnam or whatever, he did something very smart that lives with me today. Is he never said, "Oh, are you willing to die for this photo?" Because every macho photographer would say, "But of course, you know."
Yeah, yeah,
He'd say, "What is that photo worth? Is it worth losing your pinky, the
yeah,
use of your right arm,
yeah,
half your brain? That you still got to live with this, but what's it worth?" And that would pump the brakes of a lot of photographers.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Another thing, you alluded to was um, when you talk about the 98 percentile of good people out there. I mean, that's that's a lesson that you learn pretty quick in the real world out
yeah,
there. That uh, you
yeah.
know you're Marilyn Monroe. You're depending on the kindness of strangers, and that's the only thing that keeps you alive, quite literally sometimes. But what you
Under,
told me before I'd ever really made a picture was that of course your images are going to change the world because they're going to change you, not necessarily the making of the images, but like you alluded to, the experience of making the images.
yeah, I mean, look, um, I will always have other photography outside of journalism, simply because journalism is not so much about the photograph or the photographer as the experience. I mean, we were exposed to things that very, very, very few people ever have a chance to observe. And we were given that privilege because we would carry a camera and send pictures back to magazines and things like that. But what is important about that photography is what's in front of the camera. So you develop also, if you love photography, you know, you develop something where perhaps you have more influence. I mean, who knows what it is, um, but I mean, for me, it's pictures on the street. I mean, Time sent me all around the world. And that didn't mean I had to work every day. I mean, some days I couldn't work. And I would just wander around making snapshots. And those pictures were not of anything that was important. If there were to be a good picture, it would have to depend on my ability and everything like that. Both you and I have said that a huge part of our photography is documenting our family. And I don't know about you, but if you want a comfortable home life, you better make your children and your wife and any pets look pretty tremendous. No, I mean, news photography to me is about the experience, and that's why I have um, a certain problem in thinking that people should start now into that venue, because today they don't send people around the world, and they don't send them to eat lunch with very famous people. I actually had an organized crime guy once confess to me. I mean, I'm packing my gear after the reporter has left. He's not going to say anything to the reporter. I'm stuffing my cameras in the bag, and I said, "You do it?" He said, "Yeah, of course."
Well, that's the funny thing.
That's the wonderful thing. Look, President Ford, who was absolutely marvelous, was very guarded around reporters, but he would say incredible things to photographers. One time we were going, and I think it was Daryl Hikas's birthday party. I'm not sure, but I had been photographing him, and he said, "Well, I'll give you a lift." So we're going to the party, and I said, "This is really overwhelming. I'm being driven to a birthday party by the most important man in the Western world." And he looked at me and said, "Don't tell Henry you said that. He thinks he is." They would not tell that. They would not do that to a reporter. So yeah, it was wonderful.
Well, that's the thing, as photographers, we do get behind that blue curtain. We get onto the second floor of the White House, whatever it is. And the reason we get there is because we're there to make pictures, not to gossip or tell stories later on.
Yeah,
The picture is everything for us, and um, the experience is kind of, for me, it's just like the frosting on the cake. If I'm in that room and I fail to make a picture, then
yeah,
I've wasted their time, I've wasted my time, I've wasted money, I've just failed. Um,
absolutely.
so I imagine you were riding with President Ford to David Kennerly's townhouse that night. I'm guessing. Do you remember?
Nope. Hey, I'm 84. Yeah, yeah, I have problems remembering your name.
Well, I'm just saying it was a unique presidency because um, Kennerly was Ford's photographer,
Yeah,
and he was everybody's. Kennerly is a friend to every photographer, and he actually was an advocate to get photographers a little bit of access like that.
100%.
Yeah.
Without question. And everything. I mean, after David, I went down to Washington to help out with the photography when Nixon was on his way out and everything. the other guys, had all been essentially White House photographers, Washington photographers, and that's in a way kind of sets you up and everything. I mean, you have official picture calls that you attend to, and there are any number of protocols and everything. And I was sort of, the outsider, and therefore sort of expected to do things that other people didn't, and it got me in trouble. I think. I mean, the reason that I have the picture of Nixon, departing and throwing up his V's, um, is because I was banned from his last speech. Dan Rather and I went out the night before his resignation speech and photographed the anti-Nixon protester. And we were essentially, at least I was told, that therefore I would not be allowed to photograph his farewell speech and would be put in the backyard and everything. And of course, the backyard is where this picture occurred. And the speech picture was, not in any way different from any of the other headshots and everything. So in that sense, I was very lucky. Anyway, but after that, they asked me if I would stay and be the White House photographer for Time magazine. And I have to say, I found it the dullest, most boring, most god awful job. In the sense that, you went in, took a setup and everything, lined up with, I mean, the first time I did it, everybody was in front of this desk. And so I just went right over to the one side because, why have the same angle as everybody else? I was practically slaughtered for stepping out of line and everything. And so the truth is that after around 2 months of doing this, I faked a severe case of the flu and said, no, I have to come back to New York. I'm terribly ill. And managed, once I get back to New York, to never get back to Washington. And everything. I found it the most awful job. And, I think the one thing you've got to say for David is, as the guy who represents the president, not various publications, he did a hell of a lot to open up that job. It was probably a hell of a lot more pleasant, maybe something I might have actually enjoyed doing at the end of the reign, was at the beginning.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I kind of learned about Washington D.C. from you, and I don't know if that tainted my view of the place, but
it'd be a nice war. Oh God.
any place sandy. But I did exactly this. I mean, there's so many protocols and unwritten rules working in Washington that if you're not a regular there, you're going to step on somebody's toes. And I did the exact same thing. The first time I went into the Oval Office, I made two mistakes. It was Reagan's Oval Office, and I was a punk, and I was maybe 20, 21 years old, and I was wearing ripped jeans, which you didn't do for now somewhat obvious reasons, but then that would have been beyond my ability to comprehend. And then I did exactly the same thing you did. I tried to go to the side of the room because everybody else was shooting in the center. And the mistake that I made was that Dirk Halstead, who you mentioned earlier, he had shot a picture that appeared in Time the week before from the side of Reagan's desk with like Bud McFarlane and somebody else, what's his face, Don Regan, looking as if they were coaching the president, and it was a big scandal. Like they're whispering in his ear from the side of the desk. And Mark Weinberg, who was the butt boy of Reagan up until he died, physically grabbed me in the Oval Office and like shoved me back into the pack and all. And so from that time on, I would be the guy begging for a pass to go out into the Rose Garden forever from this guy who hated me. You know, I was the punk rock kid with ripped jeans who didn't know protocol.
Yeah.
So that's Washington D.C. and that was your experience in the '70s and mine in the '80s.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I want to show some pictures here about places that are easier to work. A lot of them, your pictures. Then Washington D.C. And I'm going to share our screen here if I can do this properly, which I think I can. And so you should be able to see these along with me. Whoops.
Ah, Northern Ireland. Yes, all kind. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I screwed it up again. I'm not very technically savvy.
Huh.
So here we are in Northern Ireland, which
Yeah.
I think we both can agree is a much more civilized place in Washington D.C. to work.
In a way.
Tell me about why'd you go to Northern Ireland for the first time? You were probably there accidentally, I'm guessing.
I was there accidentally. John Derniac had sent me off to Paris to do a story on new French gourmet cooking, which was much more calorie and health conscious. And I landed in London, and at that time, uh, the Troubles started again. It was 1 year after the Troubles really started and everything, and the only photographer there because nobody knew the Troubles. Marceau was Gilles Perez and everything, Magnum. And so when the Troubles sort of became a constant thing year after year after year, I got there, and to everybody's surprise, it broke out. You know, they knew it had started that 1 year. It broke out again. We didn't know it was going to go on and on and on again. So I called Time magazine and said, look, I'm essentially very, very close to Northern Ireland. Get somebody else. You know, I'm on my way to Northern Ireland to photograph the Troubles. And so I went there, and I probably stayed there for around 2 months, shooting, developing contacts, things like that. I mean, it was an amazing experience. And they did not run a single picture. And they never complained about the fact that they weren't running any of the pictures. They just didn't think it was a big enough story. On the way out, apparently an Englishman had been encouraging young English kids to go to one of the wars in Africa, telling them that they would be rewarded with officerships and major positions in the military. And of course, what they were, you know, they were just so much slaughter material and everything when they got there. And so I heard about this, and I knocked on the guy's front door, and he answered, and I took his picture. And I guess after that, he was advised, you know, do not go near the press, because I believe he was going to trial or something like that. Jean-Pierre Lafont was in Africa and actually managed to shoot some of the kids and things like that. Well, we had Time magazine now had the only picture of the guy who had promoted all of this. And they felt that that was well worth the 2 months that they had kept me and everything. And never complained. And indeed sent me back the next year. And all in all, it was an amazing experience because I got to know the leaders of the IRA. My driver's brother was in jail. as to who, and his sister ran a restaurant or a candy store or something that was famous for refusing English soldiers and everything. And Sinn Féin, which was sort of essentially the spokesarm of the entire Catholic movement and everything. What I found out to my interest, but I only realized it a few years later, was that the second in command was the head of the IRA. It was funny. I got to know a lot of the IRA people, and I was really at odds with them. I remember telling one guy who was very prominent and whose father's store had been busted up when he was a little child, literally, the huge glass windows busted, terrorized and everything by a Protestant group, saying to this guy, well, now that you've ruined it for your children, I see that you've ruined it for your grandchildren. And he said, Bill, I'd love to discuss this more. Why don't you come over to my house for dinner? And all the other journalists at the meeting, oh my God, they're going to kill him. No, he had a great dinner and we had a huge long talk about it. And I never agreed with the guys, but they gave me more leads. I mean, for instance, at one time, you may remember that the head of the sort of militant faction of the IRA was actually shot. And he tried to bury himself, but the British soldiers found him, and eventually, as much as the British doctors in a funny way admired him, he died. And there was a huge funeral procession. And for some reason, I was the only person whose taxi managed to stay right with this funeral procession and everything. And the army, or perhaps it was the Protestant-dominated police force, stopped the funeral procession, the limousine carrying them, and there was all kinds of hell to pay. And the Irish literally raised me up. I got out of the car and they raised me up on their shoulders so that I could get a shot. But at the same time, the police couldn't get to me and everything. And then they dropped me back down again. And somebody simply said to me, your car is going to be searched. And you are going to be searched. Give me your roll of film. And I did. And indeed, my car was stopped and I was searched. And I said, no, I didn't have the film and everything like that. And when I got back to Belfast, I said to the driver, well, where do you think the film is? And he opened up the hood of his car, and there, taped under the hood, was the film. And he just handed it to me. I remember once I got permission to go in and photograph the hunger strikers by posing as a family member. And two French photojournalists ratted me out. The jailers pretty much knew who I was, and they knew, but they were willing to go along with the thing. But now they had to say, oh, Bill, we're terribly sorry. You're not an actual member of the family. You're attempting to deceive us, and you must leave. And so I left, and although I didn't know it at the time, the driver that picked me up, I knew was one of the people who worked at Sinn Féin. What I didn't know is he was the leader of the IRA. And I explained to him what happened. And he said, would you tell the journalists that turned you in that they have a few days to leave Northern Ireland? My assumption being if they didn't leave, we would have them killed. He did not say that. He just said, tell them that they have a few days of safety before they leave, but they will leave. And so I told them, Jarecke told them, a whole bunch of people told them to leave, and they left. They said to me, we're terribly sorry you weren't able to get into the jail. We have a young activist who was just released from jail. And you could photograph him if you wish. Does this serve any purpose for you? Okay. And I said, yes, absolutely. And what I did is I took him into an area where there were a lot of IRA wall murals. People, the students painted them. And I posed him in front of one of those murals. And as I did, 2 truckloads of soldiers appeared. And so I did not really finish taking the pictures. And so the folks from Sinn Féin came over and said, well, did you get the pictures you wanted? And I wasn't sure, but I said, I didn't think so. Actually, I did. I was very lucky. I did get the pictures I wanted. But I said, look, if I continued to take pictures, they would have taken that kid and put him back in jail just for me taking his picture. So, seeing as he just got out of jail, I couldn't do that. And they said to me, well, that's perfectly all right. We have film of the event. We have film of you being harassed by the troops. And they gave me the film. It turns out that 2 old men who were across the street were actually photographing the entire thing. 2, and I mean old men, who were just looking like innocent observers, photographed. So
what you're describing, and I think this is important to talk about, is, and I'll start going through your other images here, but so Washington D.C. has its protocol, but conflict areas have their own protocol as well, and it's kind of it's actually more important to know this protocol whether you're in, say, Northern Ireland or Beirut or Hong Kong today. And so you would stay in the right hotel. You would drop by and make a courtesy visit to the right people. You would always have your camera on you, because if you didn't have your camera on you, then why were you there? That was your only reason for being there.
absolutely.
So tell me about the protocol, and I'm going to see what else we have in this slideshow.
Well, look, also the other thing is, you don't do one side. The Protestants were very anti-press in Northern Ireland. But the guy the journalist that I associated the most with was, the one I chose was a Protestant, because that gave me the ability to go and to talk to them also and everything. I don't know, you try to be fair and everything. Something that a local photographer today cannot do.
Right.
In other words, he'll get killed. I was allowed to be impartial.
Right.
And everything. He lives there, and he's expected to be on the side of the dominant force. And
right.
if he's in trouble. In Beirut, which is what you're looking at a picture now. Look, I photographed a group having anti-American protests that probably had some crossover members that were the same people that were involved in the killing of 300 Marines. And they put 6 guards on me so that I couldn't be touched. Today, they had the internet. The reason that they did this was not because they loved me, because I was the only outlet for the story that they wanted to tell. Today, the enemy has the internet. And so in the Middle East, they will kill journalists. I would be dead today. In the days that I worked, I had 6 bodyguards from the enemy protecting me to make sure that I wasn't hurt and that my coverage of them would go out. You know,
Sure.
absolutely different situation. Both of these pictures are bravery. The first one was, you know, when there was nothing happening, you would go to the hospital and watch them bring in bodies. What the guy is yelling is, "Don't take pictures." That very, very day in that very, very emergency room, the picture you see is obviously a guy who stepped on a landmine. A dying man said to me, "Take my picture," because he wanted to tell his story, showing him dying as an expression of the worth of what he was fighting for. And so I raised my camera in this bizarre, sort of overcrowded entrance to the emergency area. And just as I took the picture, he went like this and flashed the V for victory, thus guaranteeing that by the standards of Time magazine and everybody else working those days, that the picture would not be published.
So,
Hmm?
sorry, no, I was just going to comment this idea that the people directly involved in whatever certain misery is happening at that time are never the problem. It's always the secondary group that the do-gooders, the people looking out for the other people that start beating on photographers. Has been my experience.
Yeah, pretty much. This, by the way, this is a dead kid in a little school. The school was bombed by the Israelis. This is in, I think this was Sidon. And because they felt that terrorists were using the school, which is normally a hands-off, do not bomb building, as a place to hide their people. And of course, what happened is they killed a lot of kids and everything. And there were so many kids that all that could be done, the kids took shelter in the basement. And the basement collapsed and killed them. The explosion killed some. They couldn't even pull the bodies out of this wreckage. It was, you know, a collapsed building. So they went in and they put lime on the bodies so that the decay wouldn't be quite as, you know, disease spreading and things like that. And also, you know, so that rodents and things couldn't come and eat the kids. But this is the dead, decomposing body of a little kid who was killed when his school was bombed. I was wandering around Sidon trying to find something, and the kids came up, and we didn't speak the same language, but they dragged me off. They had figured out the only entrance, a little sort of how to get through the rubble and everything and get into the basement and everything. And they wanted to show me their fellow schoolmates and everything. And the basement was filled with the decaying decomposing bodies of little children, um, covered with lime. That's what this picture is. And this is very interesting because I don't know if it was this picture, but in things that both you and I did, I'm sure you did this too. You called and said, "Hold the press. Have I got a picture for you?" And they held the press, which was an incredibly expensive thing to do. I mean, I forget what holding a press for 30 minutes costs, much less holding it for a day or something. And in every single case, there were probably only 2 or 3 of these in my entire work history with them. I would call, somehow get communications with them when they got the picture. And they would say, "Oh no, this picture is far too horrible to run." They never ran a single picture that they held the press for because they were, quote, "too horrible." Well, what the bloody hell does somebody think a war is? That's the whole point. It's too horrible. You do not run pictures, as much as this is also a part of war, of American GIs rescuing puppy dogs. God bless American GIs and God bless puppy dogs. But that's not what a war is.
Now, every time I asked him to hold the press, I could almost guarantee that my image never ran as well. That was just kind of a rule.
Oh, well, here we are back to Northern Ireland.
Yes.
Needless to say, we do not run pictures which have in the background the word "cunts." But I did want to show you that the people of Northern Ireland are overwhelmed with wall art on both sides. But, and the kids are, needless to say, oh, well, obviously I have a propensity for kids. The stuff that I started actually started a series that Time did called Children of War.
Oh, I remember that, of course. Yeah.
But yeah,
I think you shot it in black and white, and they made you redo it in color, though, or something.
This is Tiananmen Square, and it was all shot in color, and everything. I mean, the reason that you shot color for the magazines, you may remember that the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time magazine, Life magazine, all of these publications were only in black and white and everything. And then Time magazine, for instance, I believe they were almost the first, one of the first, surely, became the colorful news weekly. And the reason they became the colorful news weekly was because they had to publish color ads. And indeed, if your news picture was on the same printer sheath as the color ad, chances are it was in color. If it was on one of the sheets that didn't have any ads, chances are it was in black and white and everything. But essentially, color came to all the news publications. Really, the demand wasn't so much for color news pictures. I'm sure there was a slight demand for it. But the real demand for color was with the advertising. And indeed, the color often misled. I mean, come on, both you and I have photographed funerals. And we know that a funeral with a bright blue sky and lovely fleecy clouds just doesn't have the power of either a color picture of a funeral on an overcast day or just plain black and white picture and everything. Color is an element. I mean, of course, I shot nothing but color. I worked for the Colorful News Weekly, but it was never an item that I could think about when I was taking. I was taking an event, and sometimes the color worked, and sometimes the color didn't work. And so when I reprint the pictures, quite often they come out in black and white. I mean, that's one of the modern wonders of digital photography. It's very easy to scan a slide and print it as a black and white. And this was originally a color picture of Tiananmen. Now here the color gives us legibility, because this is obviously Lebanon, and it's a father grieving over his lost son and everything. And in black and white, the grays of the picture, which are the picture of his son, the photograph of his son, you know, at the funeral pyre where they brought the flowers and everything, it just isn't legible. It stands out here because it's gray against the green of the plants and the red of the flowers. Now, an interesting thing, obviously, I'm interrupting a terrible moment in this family's life. The younger brother and the father. The father is what? He's obviously heartbroken. He's sobbing and everything. Nonetheless, the crude photographer had no hesitation to interrupt this man's grief and go click, 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 click. So after I had made my clicks, and as you see, was quite close to the guy, some normal lighting, I put down my camera and waited until the moment that he would leave the funeral so that he could come on over and punch the crap out of me. And when it was over, he got up and he walked towards me. And I sort of braced myself for something that would be between a physical tirade and a verbal tirade. I didn't know which. I figured probably physical. And he held out his hand with a little box of nuts and candy, which are traditional, and said, "Thank you, thank you," and gave me the candies. So, yeah, sometimes you're an ass, but these human situations continue to be educational. Yeah, 98% of the people in the wars are pretty good. Yeah. This is the Mozambique Civil War, which is the one that put me out of commission and turned me into a civilian photographer.
And any place with an AK-47 and a shovel on their flag, you just got to avoid it.
Yes, you got. But the thing is, something like Rundam did a lot of destroying the sewer lines. There were destroying the sewer lines and all kinds of things, and the health system, access to hospitals and everything collapsed. And something like 40% of the children died of disease, malaria. In a war that, let's see, I think when I photographed it, it was 17 years old.
Right.
And indeed, it was falciparum malaria that knocked me out. It eventually resulted in a tear in my heart valve. And although the hemorrhaging and the scabs would normally go to your legs and give you a problem, there's a 5% chance that it goes to your brain. And that's where it went with me. So it was sort of like Stroke City. Although I will say, in the emergency room, and by the way, when I got falciparum, unlike other people, as an American journalist, I was flown out. You can't get out of Mozambique. They have one flight out. I got incredible good treatment, and it saved my life. but 40% of those kids died. So that's what this picture is about. Yes. Well, one of the first stories that that I really got, which was a long story, was to go to Atlantic City. It was a story on gambling and everything. And indeed, the powers that be wanted the publicity. So they put me up in hotel rooms and gave me anything I wanted and everything. But my real fascination around Atlantic City became the boardwalk. It was one of the most strange and bizarre places that I have ever been in my life. And so the story wasn't, I mean, with all the help I got, with all the free hotel rooms, helicopters, if I wanted to shoot an aerial, et cetera, and complete access, it was months before they published a few pictures of the actual gambling. And I must say, I didn't spend much time photographing it. I was absolutely fascinated by the boardwalk and, and also the community of Atlantic City. Just the most bizarre community being supported by these gambling. Times Square, a billboard going up. I guess this was after really I had left, being a journalism photographer. I was very, very, very fortunate. A number of people offered me jobs, which really did not require me going around and traveling and doing things like that. But they really weren't photographic jobs; they were sort of office jobs. And so I turned them down, really, and sort of became a photographic hobbyist. And
this is recent, and so you're shooting all the time still.
Oh yes, of course. Bad habits are not easily broken.
Nor should they be.
Yeah.
Speaking of bad habits,
this was a time job. They sent me to shoot a reenactment of the Revolutionary War and everything. And we were all on the top of this hill, and we would shoot broad perspectives, huge panoramas. This, by the way, if you can see it, I don't know, can you see it? This is the latest of our many dogs. I think you probably are only getting a snout in the frame. Yes, don't go when we're on the air. Yes. Anyway, so we were supposed to do these giant panoramas of this incredible redone battlefield, which I did. But the great thing about working for Time Life is Sports Illustrated had a 1,000mm lens. Yes, a 1,000mm lens. And so I took the 1,000mm lens with me. And this, by the way, is a cropped frame and everything. So it's probably around a 2,000mm lens shot. And so these are the soldiers waiting to take place before the huge panoramic view that was run in all the magazines and things like that. Well, look, I mean, you're not on assignment. This was, I think I was still pretty much a working photographer and everything. But, you eventually came home to New York, sort of, and everything. And you wander around the street all the time. And I've always been fascinated. People say that I'm completely wrong, and I probably am. But I have been fascinated by writing, by words in pictures. I don't know who it was, but I have been told repeatedly that my pictures are limited because only people who can read English will truly appreciate this picture. Somehow that doesn't bother me. Although I will say that in France, I took some very interesting pictures that Frenchmen will be able to read and everything. But I've always loved words and pictures going together. So that's what this is.
No, I was gonna mention that you've made you're always paying attention to the written word, and most photographers can't do that very well. They kind of use it as a crutch, but you use it as an enhancement, which is a talented trick in itself.
Well, it's just, once again, this is a shot taken in retirement. I just find the world weird. Once again, what's important is in front of the camera. I mean, I didn't create this. I observed it. Now, obviously, there are brilliant and good photographers who can create images. I am not one of them. But I am absolutely fascinated by sort of disjointed madness of the world around us. I guess a lot of my pictures are kind of disorganized because one of the things I'm fascinated about is just the disorganization of the world. That's it.
So do you think, let's take somebody like Dick Avedon. Obviously he was hired to create images, but I would argue that he just created a window for things to happen, and then he observed.
Absolutely. I think that when I grew up, obviously Gene Smith, David Bestel, and people like that were my heroes. But Richard Avedon and Irving Penn, I thought the two of them were absolutely the most amazingly brilliant photographers. I mean, absolutely on a par with the documentarians and the journalists. Huge, and look, you work for a big mag, and you get a lot of prizes and awards because the magazines make sure that even if you're out of town, your images get sent off to all the contests and things like that. So because they want to talk about their prize winning. Two of the greatest prizes that I ever got in my life were Irving Penn was looking for somebody to manage a studio that he had in England. And he would only be there probably a few months a year and everything. And, during that time, obviously, we would be his assistant, but we would have the studio access. And he wasn't there. And he offered me that job. And once at a party, I was sitting next to Richard Avedon, and we were talking, and we were the two non-drinkers at the party. And of course, being Irish, I had already put the huge amount of drinking that was worthy of a lifetime behind me. So we're sitting and chatting, and he said, "My name is Richard Avedon." I said, "Yes, I know. I'm Bill Pierce." He went, "Oh, I know your work." Well, I tell you, you can get this award and that award, but those two awards, those were incredible awards. Well, this is just street. This is the heartless annoying of people, in their most, private moments and everything by a opportunistic old photographer. What can I say? Except that the second one, the couple kissing, really does lay to the fact that pictures don't have to be sharp and everything. Some pictures have to be sharp, but it's not an automatic. Some fairly decent pictures. This, by the way, was on the way to the Time Life building. I was walking to work. And
that's the entrance to the Time Life building on the right there, actually.
Yeah.
That awning.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah. So I don't.
nice.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
So that's
pretty
52nd Street.
realistic picture. No, no magazine would run that one. It's not sharp.
No, you donated this to a charity auction I did a few years back, and this was one of the highest sellers, I gotta
Oh,
say.
no kidding.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
it was right up there with, I think, Douglas's, Douglas Kirkland's Maryland went for the highest amount, but, or
well,
maybe it was
I think
Burnett's.
Maryland is a better picture.
Well,
Yeah.
you gotta, he had something really good in front of his camera. So what are you gonna do?
The amazing thing is, that Douglas and I are within 6 months of the same age, and Douglas is still shooting. I mean, professionally. I mean, he's going nuts. He's making public appearances. He's having exhibits. All kinds of things. And both of us started, I guess, our professional photography or whatever. Do you know that both of us, in the very first years that we're messing around with cameras, were writers for popular photography?
Oh, I didn't realize that about Douglas.
Yeah, Douglas wrote for popular photography, and then he left and became a, world famous professional. And then I wrote for popular photography and did not become a world famous professional. And the amazing thing is, because of that, Douglas once hired me as his assistant, right? And he's never brought it up, but I misloaded one of his cameras.
Oh dear.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Pierce, the big technical expert, didn't know how to load those big, expensive Hasselblad magazines.
Oh dear.
Yeah,
I've seen people do that before. They just can't figure out where the paper side goes.
exactly. Well, John Barnes, I had done stills for a movie that John had done because we had mutual friends who were the actors in it and everything. And Marcel was very worried that, as he aged, he would not be able to um, continue to perform and do what he did so well and everything. And so I forget who produced it, but John got the task of doing a film on Marceau that essentially would document um, all of Marceau's routines and everything. And I don't know whether John asked me or I asked John or something. I mean, I just thought it was a wonderful opportunity. But anyway, I shot on the set and everything. Um, there was no real need for a still photographer. And indeed, any other stills were done by John's son and everything. And it was an amazing experience to be able to photograph Marceau. And also, because the still photographer can give away gifts. I mean, you've been on the set for 2 or 3 days, you arrive with a nice set of still photographs to give the actors, the leads, the subjects, whatever, and they become your buddies and everything. Marceau, an incredibly complicated man. Um, he was trained by the same person that trained Jean-Louis Barrault. I forget his name. I've heard he was a great mime master. He lectured and all those kinds of things. But anyway, I gave Marceau the pictures, and over the weeks that the film was made, we sort of became speaking buddies. And indeed, I eventually ended up working for the person who worked with him the other mime that he worked with when he was in this country. But he looked at me one day and he said, "Bill, I am the greatest mime in the world. Do you like what I do?" Yeah, and to me, it was something. He was like every great artist I've known, and that wonderful complexity that's very similar among all of them. I mean, I've known great actors, you know, And 2 weeks after they have finished another job, they're afraid they will never work again in their life. Now, it's interesting. This picture of Marceau was probably done, I don't know, in the late 70s, mid 70s. He continued to work. I mean, this picture was done because he was afraid that he was no longer going to be able to do these routines. He continued to work for 15 or 20 years after that. So his fears were absolutely unfounded. The interesting thing is the still images, which were taken for no purpose, and everything, became the title frames of the movie. And this is what opens the movie. This, by the way, is life, death, and birth. This is either death or birth. They look the same. He starts crouching, and as a young man, he grows, and finally, as a full man, he stands up, and as an old man, he shrinks, and as a dead man, he turns into a fetal position, same as before he was born.
So now we have some actual important pictures.
Of course. You know, I mean, you photograph your family. This is my wife. And I probably, I make little boxes of prints. And they are of my kids and the dogs and all this kind of stuff. My wife has the only 50 print box. And the dogs and the kids, no. But I don't know whether this is because she's one of the most beautiful and wonderful and smart women I know, second only to your wife, and everything. But also, I think maybe that box of prints has contributed to buying me a happy marriage.
Well, I must say that both of us, not only did we marry up and we married beautiful women, but they have a certain amount of patience and grace that they've extended to us over the years.
Yes. I mean, they don't any longer turn their back on us when they see the camera. They just keep up. Well, this is my youngest son, who was, made a terrible choice in his life. He is a brilliant blues guitarist and everything. And there are people in the racket who will attribute this and everything. Sam and Dave, I remember Colin Tilton, the sax man and everything. I mean, Colin is the guy that would get calls at 3 a.m. This recording session is not any good. Can you get over here and kind of spice this up with a solo or something? Colin Tilton grew up in the same town as my son and everything. And so when my son decided he was going to be a musician, the first thing he did was he formed a little band. But then when they were making their first record, he had the guts to call Colin Tilton. He's a #1 session saxophone player and a guy who leads bands that may hate the lead vocalist, but they're willing to work for him because Colin is going to actually be heading up the band. He called Colin Tilton and asked him if he would make a few cuts for his teenage group's rock album. And Colin said yes. And he came down and he did this amazing recording session in which he would do a solo and said, or then again, you could do another one like this. And you do 7 or 8 cuts, for this kind of thing. And what can I say? For instance, he introduced Gene to Sam and Dave. Recording artists today are still doing Sam and Dave's written music material, which they perform brilliantly.
Right.
And Colin took Gene backstage during the intermission of the blues break and everything to meet Sam and Dave. And Sam did these two great black blues players, rather, composed so many good songs. And, I think they were relatively elder and everything at the time. And Colin brought Gene back during intermission and introduced him to Sam and Dave. They talked for some while and everything. And then either Sam or Dave said, and now, Eugene, you must leave because we're going to take some illegal drugs. I mean, which I thought was so great, looking out for the little kid. And when I was very old, I had a birthday party. And I think I reverted back to my old Irish ways and was pretty drunk. And Colin was actually playing, would you believe this? Colin Tilton was playing at my birthday party. And Sam and Dave, I don't know which one, we were gone, but I was lying down on the floor next to either Sam and Dave. I don't know which. And he turned to me and he said, for a white boy, Eugene sure can play the blues. So anyway, that's my youngest son. This is my wife. And by the way, people will say, are these pictures, are they retouched? And the answer is, you bet. Because I don't think, I have since, look, I started shooting, essentially headshots for people in the theater. But to me, there is no such thing as an unretouched portrait. Because close-ups of people's faces are simply not the realistic way that we see people. Are they hugely retouched? No, they're not. They're not. Sometimes they're barely retouched at all. But I just don't think that frozen moment and that super achromat lens are a realistic picture of a person. So I use what a lot of people think are something that makes a picture phony to make what I think is the truth. Does that make sense, or is that just some old man going right over the top?
Well, I mean, you're starting with a good subject matter. You're putting some good light on the scene. You're somewhere between a light green filter and no filter.
Yeah.
And so that's 90% of your battle there. If you have to use the cellophane during the printing process, I don't really. I mean, we all can benefit from that, I believe, right?
Well, guess who introduced me to the crumpled cellophane?
I know who did.
Mr. Reality. My crumpled cellophane came from, oh my God, a cigarette pack.
Well, it was either the cigarette smoke or the cellophane wrapper, and they both added to the luminance of the final print.
Yes. This is Judith today. Obviously, I did not marry a 20-year-old woman and everything. She is, let's see, well, I'm 84, and I don't think she'll let me say how old she is, but she is not approaching 84, to understand, but she has aged since those first pictures were taken.
Well, you're both very active as far as the creative pursuits. I mean, she runs her own theater company today.
And guess what? I get to do bit parts.
There you go.
We're right back to, are you doing anything in scene 6?
the circle of life.
Yeah. Only where we live now, of course. My God, come on. In summer stock, it was people who became famous. But out here, we live in the hills, and you can't have it's very tough to have a 9 to 5 job where we live. Anyway, so guess what? The neighborhood is actors, directors, writers, things like that.
Sure.
Because you know,
So Bill,
it's a 9 to 5 job if you live there.
no, I don't. I think it's actually against the zoning code in your neighborhood. Uh, Hippies beget other type of slackers who um, work in the creative arts.
I have one friend, one neighbor who's a doctor, but he leaves at something like 5:30 in the morning to beat the traffic. And I asked the people in his office once, when does he arrive? And they said, we don't know. He gets here before we do. And he said if he leaves 15 minutes earlier, it literally doubles his driving time to try to get into, the nearest town to do where his office is.
I'm sure. So I think we should wrap up. You started kind of in Gene Smith's loft, then you had your own loft, and your loft was was a gathering place for photographers from around the world when they came into New York for the 48-hour period. They would end up in your loft, and it was like the front of the bus. It was another learning ground and a sharing of information, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do artificially with these little video series things.
Oh, I think
And,
they do it.
well, I'm just trying to capture this oral history that should be shared.
Yes.
Um, but your loft, I think, was it like fourth in Lafayette or third in Lafayette? It was
The second loft I had was 4th Street between Lafayette and the Bowery.
right, right. It was across the street from, I think, the New York's Tower Records first location,
Yep. Yep.
and it was about a half a block away from CBGB's,
Mhm.
and it was another half a block away from the best place to buy photo books in all of New York, because they were all stolen and they were all for sale for roughly half price on the street on St. Mark's.
Yeah, and the guy, by the way, actually who lived in Brooklyn, he was a screenwriter, by the way. A relatively successful one. He had writer sessions, um, you know, at his home on the weekends, which he invited me to, which I did not attend. Um, and I will say also, I believe that many of the people who brought him the stolen books were drug addicts, carrying. And the other thing was, he was an immense fan of the actor Donald Moffat. And the reason that he liked me was simply because he had seen me walking the streets together with Donald. Anyway, Donald is the actor who never wanted to do a lead and everything, and who did 220 jobs and everything, and was just, let's put it this way, he's a hero to other actors and unknown to the audiences. I mean, Paul Newman apparently held up the first movie that he did with his wife for something like 6 weeks until Donald was available to play her father in, I think, about a 1 minute scene, maybe 2 minutes in the entire movie, because that would establish her character. And indeed, then he asked Donald, would you dub the voice in the distant shots of her with her boyfriend to show that, what she sees in this person is her father? And I mean, yeah, he was an amazing dude. But anyway, so the bookseller on the corner, who I remember well, nice guy, was a
Yeah.
Donald.
There's several books on these bookshelves behind us that were purchased from him. But that was a beautiful time. That was a time where people like you and me, we were right on the edge of Alphabet City. We were
Yeah,
we were working in the arts, I guess you could call it,
yeah.
and it was a creative time in New York City, and It's it was truly a blessing just to be there and to learn from you. I guess that's what
But
I'm saying.
it disappeared now because it's too expensive.
No, all the interesting
Um,
people have been forced
However,
out.
well, I'll tell you, the Bronx documentary, what they're doing over in the South Bronx in teaching kids, amazing. I do hope one thing, they've started also to teach motion pictures to the kids and everything. And they bring in some wonderful photographers to speak to them, and they really work with the entire community. It's absolutely, you know, ex-New York Times guy, the last guy to be shooting in Lebanon, Mike Camper, is the guy who runs it.
Yeah, we should get. I'll give Michael a call and we'll get him on this little podcast here. That's important. That's good a good reminder. Um, if you had to recommend a book for people, what would it be, Bill?
Hmm, I have absolutely no idea because if this magic camera could pull back, it would see there are on the two side walls nothing but bookshelves. And then you go to our bedroom and in the closet, they're filled with books. Um,
That's an important thing, Bill, because that's also. I mean, we. I learned that from you. I mean, I was always a big fan of the printed page because there was no other choice. But to really to really seek out photo books, and you told me once you were looking at a new book, and Judith and I forget who else was there. They're like, "Come on, Bill, let's go to dinner. You know, it's getting late." And you said, "Well, I can't just put down this book. I'm in the middle of this book." And to experience, uh, to dig into a book like a photography book like you would the written word is it's kind of a lost art, and it's something that we don't really appreciate even as photographers anymore.
well, look, it offers one thing that's very important. They're not my photographs. In other words, sometimes I see photographers and they're obsessed with their own work. Um, Better to be obsessed with other people's work. The other thing that I would say, I mean, since this is going out supposedly to a variety of photographers, including, you know, photographers who are early on starting. Um, One thing I would say that's just technical, that is terribly, 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 terribly important. Today's photographers are digital photographers. They should be. David Vestal was so happy with Photoshop in the last years of his life. And had Gene lived until Photoshop, he would have been the bloody master of it. I mean, hooray for digital photography. But there's one thing that people have to know. A digital image on a hard disk, either in your computer, you know, in a drive, or in an auxiliary, maybe 3 to 5 years before there's a decay that starts to happen. Obviously, you know, you probably got around 10, 15 years before there's disaster unless it fails mechanically and everything. The most expensive CD, 10 years. In other words, the magnetic signal of which is how we preserve digital images in our computers. It's a magnetic signal, and it decays and it disappears. Now, suppose you make not a superbly archivally processed silver print, but just a black and white pigment print on your inkjet printer. 700 years, you know, and then what they're going to say is, "Oh, look, it started to fade." So if you know anybody has had the sheer patience to stick it out to the end of this long conversation between you and I, here's the one lesson: print. Print your ass off if you want your pictures to last. Not only will the people who are dealing with your estate look at some metal box that is your hard disk and say, well, what the hell is this? And throw it away because it doesn't look like a photograph. Even if they didn't throw it away, it's not going to last as long as that simple print. Make a good print, start making prints now, make lots of prints, put them in your closet. Those will last. I mean, I would say that's the gift that we old timers can give younger photographers, you know, because they should be digital. And digital is great, but it has that one flaw. If you want to have your work last for your family, just so that your grandkids can see what grandma looked like, try to print it.
No, absolutely. Wise words. Thank you. Um, Bill, I just want to thank you for your mentorship and your friendship, and I just feel honored to talk to you and know you.
Well, you're getting silly in your old age because I never mentored you. You found out everything on your own. And really, pointing out that the exit to the bus is at the front end on the right hand side is not exactly what you would call world shattering.
Well, there's been a few times when I couldn't find the exit to the bus. So thank you all the same. I'll talk to you soon, and I just uh, thank you.
My pleasure, man. Anytime. Anytime. Thank you.